I think most of us have a sense of how in the German settlement we see how ancestors and those who preceded us here saw slavery. It has long been held. Our program today re-examines our views of the past and what statistics, what county records let us know about slavery here in northern Loudoun County, the German settlement and our immediate Quaker neighbors to the south. Our idea of doing this was something suggested to us by Eric Hartheis, who will be our key speaker today. And his interest in this, he will explain to you how he came to it. But he is one of the custodians of a old house going into ruins, essentially, at Hoysville. If Hoysville rings no bells to you, you probably don't live there, which is just about everybody, but a few of you do. And then a few of you are our neighbors just across Catoctin Creek in Taylorstown. Hoysville is the German side of Taylorstown. This side, the Lovettsville side of Taylorstown. So if you're at the mill in Taylorstown, you're in Taylorstown. But if you aren't, you come across that bridge, you're in Stautzenberger territory, you're in German territory. And it was interest in this notion. Mr. Stautzenberger started a store, a post office at Hoysville, and that led Eric to his research. So today, as you can see, he will be presenting on the geography of enslavement. And did it make a huge difference whether you were in Southern Loudoun, in Middleburg, where people voted overwhelmingly for secession, or Eastern Loudoun? Today we're Ashburn and Sterling and Leesburg and Luckensaw, where people voted overwhelmingly for secession. And here, where people voted rather markedly in the Lovettsville, Waterford, Nearsville area the other way to stay with the Union. That has always led us to some presumptions. But of course, we don't know. Is that true? What was slavery like? How did people handle enslavement here in this area that will be so unionist in their voting pattern at the beginning of the Civil War in May 1861? The way we'll run this today, Eric will present at his request after a break for refreshment and conversation between us. Probably we're going to be talking about what he's just put before us. At his request, we're going to have a panel of historians, local historians, who will be responding to his presentation and trying to put some of what he has said into historical perspective. And I will introduce that panel when they're about to be seated a little later in the program. Final part of the program is us. I think all of you have been to at least one lecture by the Lovettsville Historical Society. One of the things that makes them fun is that the people who come know things. Many of them trace ancestors back to the area, but if they don't, they're fascinated by history. So they bring a lot to the table. And the questions and their observations and their comments, I think, will be equally interesting. It's because of these three parts we decided we just better fess up and say our normal program is about an hour and a half when all is said and done. We're just going to give it 3 hours. It probably won't be. It'll probably be more like 2.5. If you have to go, the restrooms are in the building across the way. If you have to go, as in leave, please do as you need to. We are not holding you here in chains. I suppose that seems relevant for this particular program. Eric has been about 15 years in this area. He serves on the Lovettsville Historical Society's advisory committee, and he is a fellow history teacher. He teaches 11th grade U.S. History International Baccalaureate mode in the Fairfax County Public Schools, and then daily makes his way back to Lovettsville. But he's very interested in history. He's pursued this for quite a while. And as a well-trained Mary Washington grad who spent some serious time before teaching out in the real world, one of those people who came to teaching a little later, doing it a long time. But he spent his early years working for non-governmental organizations out in the nonprofit field trying to help people, and decided teaching might be the way to go for him. So, history teacher Eric Hartice on the geography of enslavement, Northern Loudoun County. Thanks, Eric. This will take you over, so you do.
Okay. Those in the balcony are. Well, it's a pleasure to be among my tribe here, history lovers, on a Sunday afternoon. The rain is coming down, talking about something that I think is very important for us. So, Rich, thank you for the invitation and for setting this up. Thanks to the Lovettsville Historical Society for all you do to educate the public about our rich history here in Lovettsville. What I want to share with you in the 45 minutes that I have of our time today is the product of my studies as a master's program in American history through the Gunnar Lehrman Institute at Pace University. In the course of that 3 years, I was able to focus almost entirely on the history of the German settlement. And I have looked forward to this day greatly to bring what I found to people of this community, to invite them to engage with that, use it as a launching pad for their own experiences or their own insights. And so that's really what I'm hoping today is about for all of us. Good civic conversations rely on good history. And we've recently had a 160-year commemoration anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. We've had a Supreme Court strike down affirmative action. We've had legislature in California take up a variety of issues, including reparations. We're going to be having some significant conversations as a nation about history and about the institution of slavery. It's right for us to try and get as clear as we can about our own history so that those conversations can be as grounded in fact as possible and they can move forward. Additionally, I want to acknowledge that my 45 minutes is very empirical in approach. Rich mentioned that I dove into some data and some mapping software in order to make this presentation. So it's going to be really data heavy and empirically oriented. I want to identify a limitation to say that we will hear very little from enslaved people, from African Americans today, and a lot about enslavement. That's a limitation that I'm aware of. And I just, in the spirit of giving you a resource that does a better job of doing that, I want to just highlight this book, Slavery and Freedom in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era. It sounds like the author might be coming to speak at some point in the future. But a resource that perhaps is going to provide a little wider spectrum than what I'll be presenting in my 45 minutes today. Finally, in keeping with best practices, I just want to acknowledge my gratitude to you in terms of your interest in your work and educating about history, as well as acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homeland we gather today. And with that, let's begin. I tell my students that context is important. And I want to share a little bit about what brought me to this question today about the geography of enslavement in the German settlement. My journey, as Rich pointed out, began to some degree in my backyard. See, my house at Eco Village is a short walk from land owned by John Stautzenberger. Like me, John Stautzenberger was born in York, Pennsylvania. Unlike me, at a very young age, 15, he enlisted in the Continental Army as a drummer boy and ended up here in Loudoun County. got married, started a family, carved a farm out of the land, ran a store, served as a colonel in the mission, or in the militia rather, and was appointed the postmaster of the Lovettsville post office. He was in many ways a pillar of the community, and the ruins of his farm are in my community today. And so I was very interested to sort of know his story, and I've spent a lot of my last 15 years trying to on the tail of this guy and his family. It's important to note that the record's very clear about John Stautzenberger as also an enslaver, a man who built wealth and power on the power of Black Americans. According to the census data, starting as early as 1820, if I were to visit him, the majority of faces that I would look upon would not look like mine. Based on the demographics that we have from the census, the main narrative at the Stautzenberger farm is not the story of German Americans, it's the story of African Americans, specifically enslaved African Americans. And this caused a shift in my thinking and a shift in my understanding of the German settlement. Was John Stautzenberger alone? Or were there others like him? Was he the early, perhaps, person who was able to grow his wealth and power utilizing slavery? Or was he just picking up on a model that exists? John Stautzenberger passed away on March 31st, 1837. In June of that year, an inventory of his estate was taken. His total value, his total worth came in at something around $15,219. This is roughly, I found, about $500 today's wealth. The most valuable item that he owned was land. Not surprising. At his death, he had 304 acres, valued at about $10,000 at the time. The next category, however, in terms of value, was in human property. The 10 people he held in slavery, according to the estate records, had a value of $2,750. All of the rest of his property paled in comparison. I had to come to terms with the fact that John Stautzenberger's wealth at the time of his death was in land and in people. And I began to ask if this was an anomaly or if there were others like him in the German settlement. Was his status unique? Where could I go to find answers to these questions? Any guesses? Court has some records, right? So let's see what primary sources and secondary sources had to say. Maybe you're familiar with Martin's Gazetteer. In 1835, it published a book describing many of the towns and villages throughout Virginia. This is what it had to say about Hoyesville, where John Stautzenberger lived. Quote, a very considerable contrast is observable in the manners of the inhabitants in different sections of the county. The part of it lying northwest of Waterford was originally settled principally by Germans and is now called the German settlement. It goes on to say, in this section, the farms are generally from 1 to 300 acres each and are mostly cultivated by free labor. In the south and east parts of the county, the farms many of them are much larger and are principally cultivated by slave labor. Briscoe Goodhart, a Taylorstown native, wrote about his experience in German settlement in the year 1900, and he wrote, quote, Germans of the northern Loudon were opposed to slavery, which they evidenced both by precept and by example. Probably not more than 1 dozen slaves were ever owned by the Germans of Loudon, unquote. And then finally, in 1853, the Quaker abolitionist and mapmaker Yardley Taylor noted in his writings, in the southern parts of the county, the farms were larger and generally cultivated by slave labor. There's other primary sources that suggest something similar. advertisements in the Genius of Liberty. Perhaps you're familiar with the database that represent the advertisements put by enslavers seeking the capture and return of enslaved people. From the year 1817 until 1842, supporting the idea of enslavement was prominent From the year 1817 to 1842, of the 217 advertisements compiled in the newspaper, The Genius of Liberty, only 4 referenced enslavers living in Loudoun's German settlement. Loudoun's largest town, the Quaker epicenter, Waterford, is mentioned just 11 times in the advertisements. However, 3 of the 11 advertisements state that they believe the former captives are hiding in Waterford. They haven't run from Waterford. The advertisements seem to suggest that the northern part of the county, German settlement, Waterford, is a place where there are very few enslavers seeking their property return. That seems to be mostly coming from other parts of the county. And finally, more recently, maybe you're familiar with Brenda Stevenson's book, Life in Black and White. Yes. Yes. She uses a fair amount of primary and secondary sources in order to address this very question, writing as she does here on page 16. German farmers of northern Loudoun County traditionally leased and bought small tracts of land on which they cultivated grains and raised sheep, cattle, and other livestock. Everyone worked on the family farm, but like the Quaker neighbors, most Germans were not slaveholders, rather. Those who did own blacks, such as Jonathan Monkhouse, or the Shovers or the Samplers, owned relatively small numbers. And finally, for my students who are looking to other sources, this is what ChatGPT has to say about slavery in Loudoun's German settlement. So what would you conclude after looking at these sources, primary and secondary, in regards to John Stoutenberger? Was he unique? Was the situation one that was widespread, or was it one that was rather isolated? Seems isolated, and that's where I was. But I wanted to push on to see, well, what was the level of unfreedom found on the Stoutenberger farm as it related to other things like the German settlement? Was the status unique? Was it different from different places in the county? How much so? That was really what drove my interest in this question. I think the other thing that drove my interest was just my mental image of the demographic, of the people who lived in the German settlement. Were they like the people who on your left, in terms of people who looked like me? Or did we need to expand in terms of the population here? Were there people who looked like the gentleman on the right side here, Yarrow Haman? I wanted to see how my image of the German settlement squared away with the data. And so off I went. Panel, this is where I'm going to be asking you to pay close attention to the sources for my information, as well as the way in which I analyze them. I'm interested in your feedback on that. Of course, all participants as well. There are 4 parts that I wanted to really drill down on. The first, like I said, is the sources and methodologies that I use. I will walk you through that and get so that you have a sense as to how I utilize them. The second part then is the conclusions that I drew from that. The third part then relates to this concept of the borderlands. What does that add to all of this? I'm hoping that when we roll out of here today, we've had a chance to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I need your help. There's something that I want to explore, but I don't have the resources. And I want to talk to see if anybody has information about the connection between enslavement and wheat here in Virginia's Haven. So those of you who have some expertise in that, I'm probably need to hear from you. Are we ready? Here we go. So the process constructing maps to address these questions starts with the Loudoun County, Virginia 1860 land tax map, compiled by Loudoun historian Wynn Saffer in 2007. This map charts the property boundary lines with the name of property owners in 1860 Loudoun. These boundaries were, as you can see, written on a modern USGS map that portrays physical features like creeks and mountains. And these details allow us to use relative location to chart it on other maps as well. It's a very useful tool. Up on the screen, I went ahead and I showed an example following George Beamer. In 1860, George Beamer owned property that was adjacent to John Stoutenberger's farm. His records are very clear, and so that's why he is going to be our example here as we walk things through. Okay. So we've got these excellent land tax maps. Additionally, as part of that, we have one page of the book that is the basis for the information that is used to compile the land tax maps. It includes the name found on the map, as well as the name of the owners or owners, the general location, the numbers of acres, dates, etc. So that is the two parts that I utilized for some of the basic data. Then I took those maps and that information and I matched them up with the 1860 slave schedule for Loudoun County. This came from a book compiled by Patricia Duncan in 2003. It involves the 1860 U.S. Census, which was the 8th count by the U.S. government, and only the second that involved modern mathematical and scientific methods to tabulate its findings. As you might be able to see, there. The page illustrates on the left column the list the names of the owner or owners or enslavers, along with the locations of the listings. The next column lists the location in the census. The next two columns contain the age and the gender of the enslaved. This is followed by a listing of black, or mulatto in the following column. And then the last column identifies the number of slave houses on the property. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. So there is a rich amount of data and numbers here for us to work with. And I went through those page by page, applied them on paper to the map to see how they turned out. And this is what my product looked like here. You can see George Beamer again. And according to the slave schedule, George Beamer enslaved 9 and 1 African Americans in the year agency. There were real limitations to the paper map, not to mention the fact that it was spread out all over my basement floor and hard for my wife to do the laundry or anybody else to do the laundry. So I knew that that wasn't going to work on its own. I began to utilize the digital format. So I plugged in all of the data I found, that is to say, people that are listed as enslavers, the number of enslaved, and the location of their property into a spreadsheet like this. And then I plotted it on a Google map, and I was able to get a map that looks something like this. Around to get a little bit of sense of that. Again, our focus is towards Beamer here. See that the slave census has it down for enslaving 11 people. And on the left side, you can see the key there. There were 6 other people in northern Loudoun County. The slave census had down as enslaving 11 people as well. And you can see the numbers that are there in terms of the left side. At this point, I thought I was onto something, but there were, again, limitations with this format because you can see there are, for example, the slavers of 2 and the slavers of 11 are both yellow here. So this is a little bit confusing. Also, it's very hard to read this map in terms of like where the pins are. I needed something a little bit more powerful. I was able to talk to my colleagues at my school, and they turned me on to ArcGIS, a pretty powerful mapping software. And I was able to plug that sheet back in again and come up with a map that looks something like this. On the left side, you can see the key that identifies the number of people enslaved by the different color of the circle and the size of the circle. So at the top, you can see one person enslaved. At the bottom, and then you can see where it is located on the map of Northern Valley. Pretty powerful stuff. Not only that, I was able to limit the things that were being displayed on the map. So I could show a map that just had enslavers of 112, where they would be dead. Or I could create a heat map of Northern Valley. So there's clusters in areas of high enslavement and areas of low enslavement. With this map. And from those maps and from that data, it seemed to me a number of conclusions emerged. First, I was surprised to see that there were no what I call belts or bubbles in Northern Loudoun County. I was expecting to see more bubbles of areas that were not marked by enslavement, that were not marked by people who were unslaved. I was expecting to see more areas of bubbles of concentrated enslavement throughout Northern Loudoun County. My view of the maps seemed to not include that. It seems to be spread pretty evenly throughout Northern Loudoun County on a macro level. Now, I'll tell you, the data has its limitations, and we'll talk some more about that. Things like towns and residents, like Waterford, for example, is not included. It's just too dense. The ridge lines of mountains are not included. But other than that, I think the maps show us a pretty good idea in terms of enslavement. And that is pretty equally random throughout the northern part. Likewise, the data doesn't suggest that there is any impact in terms of cultural or ethnic or religious concentration of the people there. It seems to be pretty widely spread. Let me give you an example. Map on the left is Lovettsville area. Map on the right is Lovettsville area. So just small samples, but you can see that to some degree the levels of enslavement around those two areas is pretty equal. If one were traveling to the Potomac along the Berlin Turnpike in 1860, one would perhaps see the same level of enslavement as if they were traveling along the Old Carolina Road towards the Potomac out of Leesburg at the time, based on a map like this. However, that's not to say everywhere in northern Loudoun County was the same when it came to enslavement. I think there are some important distinctions here that need to be brought to the fore. Of the 48 enslavers who were counted with just one captive, that is one person enslaved, all but 5 are located west of the Catoctin Mountain Range. All but 5 are located in the Catoctin Valley or west. A high concentration of enslaving one person is found between the Short Hill Mountains and the Blue Ridge. Few were located east of the Catoctin Mountains around Leesburg or near what is the James Monroe Highway today. This seems to support Stevenson's assertion. But like the Quaker neighbors, most Germans were not slaveholders, and those who did owe a relatively small amount. Similar pattern appears when we sort just for 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 captives. We'll see high concentrations of them west of the Catoctin Mountains, very low concentrations east of the Catoctin Mountains. It's not until we search for slavers of 8 or more people that we see a shift occur from west of the Catoctin Mountains to east of the Catoctin Mountains. Because as the number of enslaved people climbs, we're going to see owners counting with 10 or, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. It's not until we get to 8 or more that we see a change in this pattern. Because as the number of enslaved people per owner climbs higher, it's difficult to get a meaningful geographic distribution due to the limited number of people that own those numbers. There are only 3 enslavers counted with 10 captives in northern Loudoun County in 1860. However, all of the owners of 8 or more are charted on one map. For the first time, we see a significant majority are found on the east side of the Catoctin Mountains. Did I make myself clear on that? This pattern is reflected in the item, the last item on the slave schedule, which is slave houses. When the data for the location and the number of slave houses on a property is overlaid on northern Loudoun County, we find a similar pattern. Houses for slaves are spread equally throughout the area. However, where we have properties with 7 slave houses, 8 slave houses, etc., we're going to see those concentrated on the eastern side of the Catoctin Mountains, and slave properties with fewer slave houses on the western side. We'll see a similar pattern as well when it comes to the rental of enslaved people. We're going to see high populations of rental going on in the German settlement, in the Waterford area, between the hills, and less rental happening east of the Catoctin Mountains. Let me just say a word about limitations here before we get too far into this. I recognize that there are limitations in terms of the numbers that we have included to make these maps. Some things are going to be clear, like some enslavers have no slave houses listed, even though they are enslaving a number of people. Robert Wright of Wheatland, for example, in 1860, he had 26 enslaved people, 0 slave houses counted at his property in Wheatland. That's probably, he's probably not alone in terms of that anomaly. Another issue that we're going to see is that there are, in terms of parcels of land, where the last name of the owner on the tax map, in some cases there's going to be different spellings, or there'll be multiple people. So it will be very hard to correctly identify exactly whom is the owner of that land and whether they align with the person who is listed in the slave schedule. There are a number of issues that this method brought to my attention. However, after working with this material for quite a period of time, given the size and the scope of the study, these unresolved method issues or source issues are ones that I think we can work in as part of the margin of error. That they shouldn't be viewed, in my view, as an insurmountable barrier in terms of utilizing this data to get some insights about enslavement. Given the information comes from more than 100,000 acres of property, 147 pages of census data, and with as many as 41 entries per page, it's safe to say that the large trends are generally dependable. Reinforcing this idea is a comparison of enslavement in the Fox Tax District, northern Loudoun County, with the rest of Loudoun County. A chart of 180 slaveholders in the Fox District is compared to 670 slaveholders here in this chart. Except for those who enslaved just one person, where the Fox District, or northern Loudoun, which is in yellow, is much higher than the orange, which is Loudoun County writ large, we're going to see some real similarities between the level of enslavement throughout Loudoun County, whether that's northern Loudoun County or the rest of the county. I took this as a sign that the numbers in general were solid that we had been working with. given this comparison. Let's bring it back to our question here as we try and bring to some concluding thoughts here. I started with this question of whether the level of unfreedom found at the Stoutenberger farm was an anomaly or part of a larger trend throughout the German settlement. Was John Stoutenberger's status as an enslaver unique? The data I have doesn't necessarily answer that question, but I will say by 1860, the presence of slavery throughout the German settlement was not unique. The number of enslaved would have stood out among the number of enslaved that John Stoutenberger had as part of his property in 1837 would have stood out on the higher end, but the notion of unfreedom would not have. That it would have been something that would have been widely present throughout the German settlement. Do the images of the people who lived in the German settlement, do I need to perhaps adjust my thinking and consider people who look different than I do in terms of the people living here? I think the answer to that question is yes. As my friend Rich Gillespie often points out, there's no one single Loudoun County. There are many Loudons, and to a strong degree, northern Loudoun County reflected these multiple societies up against one another in many cases. In the Fox Tax area, the Catoctin Mountains was generally a place, east of the Catoctin Mountains rather, was generally a place of large farms, large slave holdings, and relatively large numbers of slave houses. We might say this is the land of the gentry. We might say this is the land of the planter class. On the west side of the Catoctin Mountains, we see something different. We see a different society. Enslavement of Black Americans was equally present on both sides of the mountains, but the levels of slave ownership were lower, and in general, we find fewer slave houses and higher levels of slave rent. This was a region with a history of resistance to slavery, that is true. This was also an area where many groups of whites were distinguished by their religious and cultural beliefs and practices. While these isolated populations may have been economically successful, they weren't always central to Loudoun society and Loudoun's politics, however. So what we see are societies, different societies, side by side in some cases, or intertwined in other cases. In some cases, getting along well, in some cases, working in order to achieve economic or political goals, in some cases, struggling with one another. As Rich mentioned in the introduction, we can see some of that with the voting that occurred May 23rd, 1861, when Loudoun went to the polls in order to address the question of the ordinance of secession. On the question, Loudoners in general voted 2-1 in favor. Leesburg had the largest yes vote of any polling place. The connection between secession and slavery was illustrated by planter Noble Braden, who urged his neighbor Israel Warner to, quote, "show your colors and vote for secession," to which Warner demurred, replying, "if you're going to fight for the Negroes, here are mine, take them." Northern Loudoun voted in large numbers against secession. Lovettsville had the largest no vote. Waterford had the largest percentage against as well. Short of counties that would become part of West Virginia, no county had more no votes than Loudoun County did. So the presence of slavery was ubiquitous throughout Loudoun County, but there were conflicts nonetheless, I think, as this shows. As those of you who know the story of the Loudoun Independent Rangers, you know how that conflict is going to call forth young men to step forward and risk their lives in terms of fighting for a variety of things. I would suggest that one of the things that drove these differences in the election, as well as in the creation of the Loudoun Independent Rangers, was the notion of slave societies and societies with slaves. In slave societies, we see slavery stood at the economic center of production, and the master-slave relationship was the mode for social relations. In societies with slaves, we see something different. We see slavery as just one of many forms of labor. Free labor, indentured servitude, apprentices, family members are all part of it. Slavery was not central to the production process, and it was present, it was not definitive in economic or social status. And what I would suggest to you today is that part of what drove differences at the polls, as well as differences in the course of the Civil War, were these two societies rubbing up against each other, conflicting with one another to some degree. Finally, borderlands. What does borderlands have to do with this? Instead of perhaps talking about the German settlement as a place where there was no or little enslavement, which I think the data clearly or convincingly shows that that's not the case, maybe we need to change our focus and talk about German settlement as a borderland. This is a topic that we've talked about in other contexts, particularly as it deals with the military during the Civil War, how Loudon was a place where armies would sweep in, have an impact, but not necessarily control, would leave, and another army would sweep in with a different agenda or a different way of doing things. And that being the case over 5 Aprils. Maybe we need to be talking about enslavement in the German settlement in a similar way, much more fluid, with the ideas of it growing and expanding, or contracting in different places at different times. Maybe the notion of borderlands as the way to talk about enslavement in the German settlement is perhaps a metaphor that's more useful for us because it talks about the fluidity, it talks about the structures of change and conflict that are part of it in a way that perhaps some of the quotes that we examined at the beginning don't quite get to. The metaphor of borderlands, a place where nobody is really, where no agenda or is necessarily in control, where forces are playing off against one another, is one that might be a useful tool for us moving forward. Because the data convinces me that we need to do more than talk about the northern part of Loudon as a place that was opposed to slavery, where there were very few slave owners. Almost out of time here, so let me just wrap things up with two final points actually. Finally, slave societies or societies that with slavery are driven by, to some degree, commodity, driven by the desire to create things. In the Chesapeake region in the 18th century, we saw tobacco as slave societies. Here in Virginia, I'm thinking in the Piedmont region, I'm thinking that the production of wheat is one that is going to drive slave societies. That we're going to see large planters with large enslaved populations be able to produce wheat crops that are large and very efficiently, because of transportation, get them to places like merchants in Baltimore or in Georgetown or Alexandria, sell them to newly open markets in places like Europe. But this is going to create conflict between small farmers and their ability to compete. That perhaps this conflict between societies with slaves, slave societies, is perhaps connected to the production of wheat. That's my hypothesis, at least. And I wanted to leave you on that, and if people have insights or resources to help you with that, to explore that, just let me know. I think I've gone over my time here. I probably should turn it back over to Richard to add.
Oh, and I'm sorry, final point, all of this material
for this project and other projects that I'm involved in. So happy to share that with you as well.
Yeah. What I'd like you to converse about during our refreshment break, just across the little alley here and the congregational building, is this. This story does not take place over a huge amount of time. This story takes place in a very limited amount of time. The Stautzenberger story, as we know it, with multiple slaves, store, and a post office east of Lovettsville and Hoyesville, 5 miles from here, takes place in 1835 on. Okay? Most of you are historians enough to know the 1830s was a time of magnificent change. It was the Jacksonian era, the birth of the common man. And it was a time of massive change locally. Most of you start thinking, what's the biggest single change we'll hear? That whistle that anybody who lives around here goes to bed hearing, the train whistle. The Baltimore and Ohio building its tracks in the mid-1830s through Point of Rocks, right opposite us at Berlin, on to Harper's Ferry. That's there. We know it's a time of massive immigration and a time also of massive tension about immigration. We know it is a time when we thought, resolved temporarily the great issue of slavery. Hadn't we? Back in 1820, Missouri wants to come in. Fortunately, down east wants to break off from Massachusetts to create the new state of Maine. And we sort of resolved it. And somehow Arkansas comes in and matches up with Michigan, and everything seems to sort of work out. And then a few years down the line, in the 40s, we have Iowa wants to come in and Wisconsin wants to come in. At the same time, we have to decide whether we're going to take the former Spanish or Mexican colonies of Florida and Texas. So we seem to be raising the issue, but somehow for a moment in time, we're balancing that. Now, Eric comes in and brings us to 1850 to 60. And here, all of you know, one magic date in the 1850 decade just flashes red lights all over the place, doesn't it? 1859 puts us on the map. When John Brown attacks Harper's Ferry, who's the first person who's captured that's mentioned in the newspaper, but a farmer from Hillsborough, from between the hills, in the area that Eric's looking at. So what I'm going to ask you to think about is, you've heard Eric's conclusions, his huge question on the economy of wheat. We know the economy of scale is beginning to take place in many other ways. We're already having trouble competing with the Midwest in terms of wheat production because of their land is flatter and that kind of a thing. But what we need to do is to take what you just heard and put it into that 25-year span and realize what's also happening here. That would take the simplistic view we've had of the Germans and slavery and turn this into this concept that Eric raises at the borderline. Turns it into this time of twist and shout, change and twerk. We societally, in what you might say would be, in Mariner's terms, yaw, that kind of a thing. So we're going to ask our panel when they come back, and I'll introduce them after our break. And we're going to ask them to, noting the when, noting some of Eric's conclusions, to try to make some sense out of this, to try to put this into some time context. As always, we will pass the hat. I know I see some of you sitting anxiously thinking to yourself, I so want to give to the Lovettsville Historical Society so that we can make sure that we put that new addition on the museum that's just behind us on Pennsylvania Avenue. But we will pass the hat between the panel and when we open it up for your public discussion. Restrooms are across the way, lemonade, tea, soft drinks. We have cheese and veggie platter. We have cookies and the like. What we really want is to use the food and the libations to encourage your conversations, to see if you can start making some sense out of the data you just saw. We'll be back at 3:15 sharp. Restrooms in the far back corner of that. All right. I would like to thank Eric for stepping forth with this study and leaving it open-ended enough for us to begin to make some sense of this. And I think that's where it becomes the most fun. Our panel, let me introduce them. They're going to be the ones reacting to this. And I'm just going to go right around the table from my left to right. Far left in royal blue, Dennis Fry, a former chief historian at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. Dennis is a longtime resident of the area. His people originally from the Lovettsville area, and then they up and left and crossed the river and went to just south of Boonesboro near Gaplin, which of course in 19th century terms means right next door. Today it seems more distant, but back in the day when you had ferries and fords and bridges and all kinds of things, people just went back and forth. Anyway, a long-term student of the Civil War and, as I say, historian at Harpers Ferry Historical Park. Win Saffer, the rumor is he is homeless, that he lives at Thomas Balch Library, but that's not actually true. He lives just north of Mount Zion Church outside of Aldie on Watson Road, and he has been a student of Loudoun County since he was born here, raised here. Win is the fellow who has done the map work that allowed a good piece of what Eric has done. And he is there constantly studying all kinds of topics in Loudoun history. But one of the ones that's most fascinated him is not just property ownership, but slave ownership as well. Next to Win, this is Bronwyn Souders. Bronwyn Souders is probably the expert on studying the Underground Railroad, enslavement, and the post-war years for the African-American community, working with the Waterford Foundation over many, many years. If you've seen any of the Waterford Foundation's books, she has her name on some. Her husband, John, who is the co-author with Taylor Chamberlain over here, Between Reb and Yank, easily the best book on Northern Loudoun in the Civil War. He is also on our panel. Donna Bohannon is well known to many of you. She chairs the Black History Committee that operates through the Thomas Balch Library of History and Genealogy, and is well known for her work on a study of how we could best deal with the many stories of Loudoun County's courthouse and courthouse grounds in Leesburg. Also, we have Lori Kimball. Lori is on the board of directors of the Lovettsville Historical Society, lives here locally. You may remember her from working on the staff at Oatlands, later being the executive director of the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum, and currently works for the county of Loudoun in the clerk's office. So she's been working with history for a long, long time. So our panel bring different strengths to this. And as Eric and Mike and I and Ed and others worked on this, we tried to put together a small panel. The rest of the panel for part 3 are all of you people, and start to think of what we could say about what you bring to the history table when we're looking at this part of Loudoun County's history. So we're going to let them have first crack at it. And then once that winds down a bit, then we'll rejuvenate things for you in the audience to make commentary, to ask questions of Eric and or the panel, your choice, and that should make an interesting afternoon. Restrooms, you know where they are. Please don't be, many of you are of that tender age in which when you need to, just go out the door and come back. We'll know that you're just going to make a phone call. Or something like that, or have a cigarette out in front of the church. My job is to get things started with a series of questions, supposedly. And that was something that I suggested. And probably like you, I am in a position of saying, where do we begin? Well, I posed my overall question to all of us, and that is that this study that Eric has looked at comes in a very specific moment in American time, and particularly a specific moment in this region's time and in the Commonwealth's time. I wanted to just ask you, what's the biggest city in the South between 1850 and 1860? Baltimore, Bill Wilkins says correctly, 200,000 people by the 1860 census. Think about that. That's huge. Okay. And who do we trade with here? So it's on the rise. It's going up. Point well taken. If we wait, it'll go to 243. Those people in Baltimore, they're busy. Who we trade with? Just think about that at that time. We are in the greater orbit on one of America's great cities, and certainly the South's greatest city. We're not near Charleston, 40,000 people. We're not near Richmond, 38,000 people. We're near Baltimore. And Alexandria is large as well. And if you've ever read any book, you've probably read Frederick Douglass's narrative, in which he talks about working in the shipyards of Baltimore. And if you think about that, you realize even from his account of the 1830s, times are changing. So I'm going to just lay that before you, that the time we're playing with is a changing time. And I would like you now to respond in any way you would like to what Eric has put before us. We're not going to choose an order. We're just going to let it roll. If you'd like to speak first, we will ask you to grab the mic and we'll pass it. Get this up ever so closer to you. Oh, this is the beer for you. No, it's cold water. I'll put that up here. You will need it. We're just going to sort of slide this around as we go. Stand correctly. I will step down from the hill, the fool on the hill department. Yeah, you can see how these turn on because you're not idiots. They're already on. All right, so we're off. Would anyone like to begin our discussion? I may break into you if I have a question or clarification I wish.
If I would like to start. Again, my name is Donna Bohannon. I'm the chair of the Black History. And before we get into perhaps a lot of scholarly detail, I wanted to acknowledge Eric, because Eric, I want to acknowledge, thank you for the way that you presented the information, especially talking about the estate. I think that in terms of you making an express comment, the story and your research did not include the voices of the state, but then also in the Shenandoah region. Thank you. That is very, I think, important to do as we talk about a very sensitive subject, especially to somebody like me that's a descendant of the estate. I also want to thank you and acknowledge that you acknowledge the Native people of this region. So, yeah.
Eric, you've done a terrific job pulling together the information. This subject, something no one has ever done before. But my question to begin was, what was behind the assumption that was all made that this area was first closed?
What was behind that assumption was the many sources, primary and secondary, that seemed to reinforce the notion that the German settlement had few enslaved people and few enslavers. And it shows up in my writing. And I was surprised to see that the data seemed to go in a different direction there. So that's what drove my interest.
Studying history of Waterford. Only late in the game, things that are used the same day they used it, brought a ring around the Waterford. Slave ownership almost throughout. We've demonstrated but it was the rule, not the exception. Once we got beyond slavery society, that slavery, practice to use whatever. Yet I left other societies that were more agreeable. As well, it was based on M's magisterial work. It's simply a matter of using one month the data that put together this one on the census data and going down the line, filling in my case, I literally colored it property to a dark, if they own African American, gray if they Spain. I was at this interested as to why, and you answered, and I had the same kind of assumption. Although in Waterford, the Quakers were quite in earnest, they were quite serious. But it was a battle that they kept fighting until they were still fighting the battle with among their own members as late as 1855. Anyway, I won't go on. Thank you.
One of the things that we have a habit of doing is thinking of the past as monolithic. I mean, in the sense that a question for us to keep in mind is, are the Germans between the 1830s and 1861 changing, evolving? All right, some of you are such regulars, you probably remember this story from last month. What decade did they stop doing sermons in this church and in the Lutheran church in Lovettsville in German? By demand, probably led by at least one preacher, but by younger members of the community? When did they stop doing that? Our resident historian here, 1830s. Boy, that decade pops up again. And the question becomes, if you relinquish that part of the old country, what else are you relinquishing? What other Virginiaizations are occurring to you?
I hope I can figure out how to use this. Let's see, the first, I wrote down several things you asked about sources. One of the sources I don't know if you used or not, you didn't mention it, was the Virginia German by Klaus Woos. If you've read that, it really gives you a sense of Germans and knowing the community and what they're like and various features about them. So I'd say if you haven't read that, read that. Also, the agricultural censuses of 1850 and 1860. You didn't mention that you use those or not. One of the clear things about that is the number of acres that are in usage. That if you look at the tax records, I've got total acreages, but when you get down into these eastern parts of the county and other places, an Eastern Loudner couldn't make a living off of about 600 acres because they waste their land. So all these slaveholders, they might have 600 acres, but they're only tilling 300. Up in the German settlement, if you had 100 acres, you're probably farming a full 100 acres and you're getting productivity out of it. So I think that's something to look at. The agriculture will show you how much acres is in production of the total acreage that the person owns. So I think that's an important source. And then the other thing, 1810 to 1840 census. I know you listed those for Stoutenberger. But one of the things I observed years ago, going through the census, trying to analyze things, as you go through the census, in the slaveholding areas of the county, you couldn't go a page through the census without all kinds of slaves. Almost every plantation, every farm, there's slaves. But when you hit the northern section of the county, you'd go page after page and found 0 slaves. And I think that was symbolic to me, the difference between the sections. We didn't show the map from John Fine, County, the Civil War, about 2 sections, pro-Confederate and pro-Union. But I think, again, that map clearly shows that sentiment. The last comment I'll make right now, hopefully more, is about generalities in history are just that. We as historians all know that there are exceptions and anomalies, whether generalized. That doesn't mean that those generalities aren't true. And I think in the case of the Lovettsville area, those generalities are true. They're just exceptions to those.
I really like your borderland notion. Is this coming through? Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay. I think that it's difficult to not understand or to simply overlook the connection, the very tight connection between Frederick County, Maryland, Washington County, Maryland, and Loudoun County, Virginia, and Jefferson County, Virginia. You need to think of that as a quadrant rather than separations of state and boundary with Potomac River. This is a very uniform area with respect to a homogeneous people, of white people, with the German influence, Scots-Irish influence. And the African-American presence in these 4 counties, Washington County, Frederick County, Loudoun County, and Jefferson County, is something that, again, I think if you look at it in a regional context, very interesting. I'll pose a question, but I'll give you a point first. In Washington County, Maryland, Frederick County, Maryland, as all of you know, Maryland is a slave state. There's a star on the Confederate flag for the state of Maryland. when Lee went north in 1862, the invasion did not start in Maryland. The invasion would have started in Pennsylvania. That's enemy country, not Maryland. Maryland's not enemy country for right. And so, interesting, in Maryland, in Frederick County, in Washington County, from 1820 to 1860, the enslaved population reduces. It steadily decreases in number. Why is that? What's motivating that decrease in enslaved population in Frederick County and Washington County? Here in Loudoun County, what's happening during that time period between 1820 and 1860? Are those that are enslaved, is their population decreasing or increasing during that time frame?
I was just going to add or think that, based on your presentation, you asked us to consider we. And then, I'm not sure if it was you and Rich that mentioned the railroad. And so maybe the idea was, maybe the enslavement of people was based on economics. And so to the extent that perhaps there being more demand for wheat, perhaps, and with the railroad making the transportation of it more accessible, then the need here would have been to get more labor. And so through renting, and I would say to you, it would be interesting to kind of understand who who were the renters. Was it the other side of the mountain, the landed gentry that was renting, and that the population here use that labor?
And some of that does come out of the census, but we also have in the court records what are called judgments for, those are small lawsuits where people are suing for money. It's not of equity, but for money. And there are some judgments for people, men here in the German settlement. One of them was in Eberhard. I don't remember the first name, but he was hiring an enslaved woman from Leesburg, and he did not follow through with paying the enslaver. And so the enslaver took him to court. So there are some other sources there, I guess, looking at the very micro level. And I think the answer to some of these questions actually will be future research and additional research, and looking at the very, very micro level, almost person by person, to figure out what the pattern is. And to follow up on something that Dennis said related to the region, we have documented some enslaved people here in the German settlement where their background, either they came from Maryland, from Frederick County, or their parents did. So that connection over the river, my familiarity is a lot with Oatlands in southwestern Loudoun County, and it is very different from up here where that connection across the river, we just didn't see that down in that part. That connection was more the Tidewater.
Yeah, my own genealogy is an example of this. My family's the Fry family here in Loudoun County, in Lovettsville. The local Lutheran cemetery is full of Frys that are part of my family. And when my grandparents left Loudoun County, they didn't go far. They went across the river, which was not considered a barrier. And they went into Maryland in Pleasant Valley, just north of Harper's Ferry, which is very close. And the way that they did it was along the river road that ran up along the nose of Short Hill, which today you can still walk. Part of it, a lot of it's in National Park in Harper's Ferry. And so this was a very close-knit, bound, genealogically connected community where the river's really not much of a barrier, and even state boundaries are not much of a barrier. So I think you're onto something with this idea that you have of this northern enclave here in this part of the county. But back to the point of wheat and wheat production, and I'm glad Donna brought this up. We know that Loudoun County is a great wheat producer. The two counties in Maryland that produce the greatest amount of wheat in the entire state are Frederick County and Washington County. So here are the two great wheat producers, the breadbasket of Maryland. And it has been the breadbasket of Maryland since the 1770s, where wheat's been the #1 grain production. So we're getting close to almost 100 years of wheat production. It's king. Yet in Washington County and Frederick County, as I noted earlier, the enslaved population has decreased dramatically in those two counties. So wheat production expands, enslaved population decreases in Frederick County and Washington County. And my point is this, that Rich says we're pretty much status quo here in Loudoun County in terms of what is the enslaved population in 1820 and the enslaved population in 1860. May I suggest that one reason it's status quo is not because of what's happening in your area or what's happening in your area, Laurie, where the slave populations are increased dramatically in other parts of the county. Whereas possibly, if you did a survey of 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860, and you look at the enslaved numbers, which is a much more difficult thing to do because we don't have those census records in the same way that we have in 1850 and 1860, which makes that analysis so much easier. It would be interesting to see what's happening in this enclave here that you've studied, to see if there's any comparable to the decrease in the actual number of enslaved as is happening just north in Frederick County, Washington County, and whether that influence is happening as well.
Enslaved in this area. I've got, as you mentioned, 1850 and 1860 slave statements compiled by Richard Duncan. And it strikes me in going through these, the names are listed, yes, by area. But the ages of the enslaved are so young. Strikes me as just a huge workforce ready to come, and yet this will happen, and they won't. They'll be free. They'll be freed. Okay, I guess that's all. I guess that's all I'll say.
And thank you, Eric, for your groundbreaking research. I should have said that earlier. It's really a very fascinating look. And as a researcher, my mind goes to all of the additional research questions and things to learn. Like I'm fascinated in learning more about the slave dwellings that were recorded in the 1860 census. And as I go on my walks on the gravel roads, where are those buildings? Are they, because it's not, we have this picture in our minds of sort of wooden shacks out in the field, but that wasn't the case. At Oatlands, they were stone. Some of them were in what were called the garden dependencies. So some of these buildings that we look at around here may actually have been where enslaved people lived, you know, one at a time, two small families. But another comment was, we're talking about enslavement as in owning people, but there's also being involved out here. Even if you did not enslave people, you are still involved with slavery. For example, I was at work looking at what are called the patroller papers, where white men went out on foot and horseback to patrol looking for freedom seekers. And I pulled one particularly after John Brown's raid in November of 1859. The patrollers are chosen almost specifically from, obviously, makes sense, the Lovettsville and Waterford area. And they are going from Point of Rocks all the way up through to over the mountain into Clark County. But our, here in this borderland, so looking at borderland as the geographic term, the impact of the people who lived here, even if they didn't enslave someone, they're involved. And so I was trying to look at the names of the men who were the patrollers in that particular time period. And maybe a third of them, maybe a half, I could figure out did enslave people, but the others did not. But they're still involved, and they're still actively involved in this particular case, trying to locate people and to watch. And they are directed to go wherever enslaved people are and look. They can go into the borders, they can go wherever they gather. That's explicit in the court order in our own books.
Just to follow up on that, in the Waterford area after John Brown raid, the patrollers were almost exclusively including the place where we go, but all up and down. One after the other, you could see that they were involved in the fact.
Eric, I wanted to follow up on your last question to us, to the group, and that's the difference between a slave society and society with slaves or with the enslaved. Again, as we talk afterwards, I think that's a very excellent question and a way to look at this area. I think we talked about the nuance of the stories and the story here in particular. And not looking at just the general story, like you spoke about earlier, is having the opportunity to really delve into the records and the different stories and trying to figure out where we are. So again, I want to thank you and I appreciate you bringing that here and your research. I wanted to say I did like the methodology, and also I like the other ideas that have come up here. You know, looking at across the state, the surrounding areas, and seeing how it all affects what happened here. And again, it's those nuances that if we just stick with one idea, we don't give ourselves the opportunity to think about other possibilities.
There's also I think, a significant population that was not the focus of your study, but is one that is worthy of further analysis. And that is the quote, free black, the free black population. Of course, we always have to put that in quotes because we all know that free black is not free in Virginia or Maryland. There are many codes, laws, restrictions, regulations that none of us would consider as free. But I don't know what the percentage of the free black population is in your study here. I asked Rich for plus statistics before we came together and said that according to the 1860 census, 1,252 free blacks in Loudoun County in 1860. What's interesting here also is, again, I looked at my perspective today. I thought perhaps Williams and Rich wanted me on the panel to look at a regional point of view, put your work into a context of a larger sphere. And so I've done that, and I discovered that, and again, nearby Washington County and Frederick County in Maryland, slave state, slave territory, that we do have a sizable free black population in both of those counties. I also discovered that Baltimore City, as we've already pointed out, is the largest city, not only in Maryland, but the largest city in the South. Remembering, of course, the Mason-Dixon line south. So it's by far the largest city in the South. But what's fascinating is that Baltimore also has the largest free black population in the South. 25,680 free blacks. 25,000 in Baltimore City. 1860 census. Yes. And interesting, more so in the state of Maryland, the slave state, we have 87,000 enslaved. In the state of Maryland in 1860, we have 85,000 free blacks. this has to influence what's happening right here. Again, if we don't think of the Potomac River as an international border, and we think of the commerce and the economic ties and the genealogical ties of this community that just across the Potomac, these are influences, I think, here that are difficult to measure, but are probably quite prevalent. And then, as Richard mentioned, with the connection to Baltimore, I'll give you one final point. Catherine Maggie is here in the front row. Catherine and I had the pleasure of writing my latest book, Confluence, Harper's Ferry. I could never write a book on Harper's Ferry while I worked there, because at that time the government had a thing called ethics. That ethics is long gone, and I'm now retired. And so my first project in retirement was to write a book on Harper's Ferry, which I spent 45 years researching. And so here it is. And Catherine, who worked for the Harper's Ferry Historical Association at the time, was editor, and she was so engaged in the project that she became co-author in the book. But one thing that we discovered, which I thought was really fascinating, is that in 1830, a trip from Harper's Ferry to Baltimore took 3.5 days. One way. One way. In 1840, with the completion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad through this area, and with the connection with the bridge completed at Harper's Ferry, we could get on a train in Harper's Ferry and be in Baltimore. Remember, previously, a decade earlier, 3.5 days. We are in Baltimore in 3.5 hours. Now, that is a revolution. That defines the word revolution. And this is an influence on what's happening here in this part of Loudoun County, because your access to the railroad via Point of Rocks, it's your neighbor. It's there. That's your railroad, even though it's in Maryland. People in this part of the county, that's your railroad. And so I think it's really significant we have to look at these factors that influence what's happening here. And that's way beyond what you've done. But it's really fascinating to look at these influences that are helping to make decisions about how we look at the perspective of enslavement, free blacks, enslavers, and the white population that owned it. No.
That John and I came across as we were working on Rock and Weary Lane, show from the time of storm, the history of Waterford's Black communities, and you asked about the number of free blacks. I think I estimated in about 1860 that it was 5 to 1 slave to free in Loudoun, 1 to 5. So really, and I can't address levels. But I also wanted to, for my previous point, I also wanted to add these 2 books, 1850, 1860 slave schedules. A tremendous number of farms are Lovettsville names. So that supports at least a fairly substantial population, I must say.
There were 2 points I wanted to make about possible reasons for not relying totally on statistics. One of the things I ran across when I was working on Friends of the Arcola slave quarters was one of the Lewis families that lived down on what's present day Route 28 in Fairfax County. They were renting some slaves. And to me, it's like, well, renting slaves, owning slaves, what's the difference? But at that time, some of these people believed that renting wasn't evil like ownership was. And so I think that's something else that goes back at as to what the attitudes were at the time. So some people in the Lovettsville area might feel that if they rent a slave, they're not doing something wrong as if they bought a slave. So, yeah, so I think that's something you have to weigh in. And the other point I made to Lori earlier was about families. Are those Stoutenberger enslaved part of a family or a family group? Sometimes people wouldn't sell slaves because they didn't want to break up a family. Or they might buy slaves to put a family back together. So issues like that, it's hard for us to judge from a statistic. We don't know that these people are related or not. So we can't see if there was other motivations involved in the purchase or sales.
Let's commend Lori for records we have in Loudoun County are really remarkable. And for anyone wanting to do research on their family, neighbor's family, or someone else, there's just a tremendous amount of information there. And I think we discovered all of it. It sounds as if sometimes boxes are appearing and people realize what's in them. So, as one who's used them a lot, meant to everyone.
You all recall that he showed an inventory, an estate inventory in 1837. That was a good piece of prima facie evidence. You know, what's sickening about that inventory is you see people with a value of something. And it's not a human value, it's an economic, it's monetary. It's for us, it's sickening, it's demeaning, it's literally un-American. Yet that's who we were as Americans. And to not talk about it, to ignore it, or to try to do anything but acknowledge the awfulness of placing monetary economic value on a human life. That's who we were. Virginians were really good. Really good. I'll say that as a Virginian with my family. I haven't discovered that we were any owners, but we may have been renters. I don't know. I do know this, that in 1837, based on your research, Eric, there were 10 enslaved people in that inventory. Is that correct? Is it 10? I think so, yeah. 11, pardon me. And your average value turned out to be around 27. Well, the total value, I guess, was $2,750. That's what I wrote down that you said, $2,750. So 11, $2,750. It's, more than $250 per individual. By 1860, this is the point I wish to make. There's a myth that slave value had decreased, that the value of an enslaved person had gone down. This is a myth. As Catherine and I point out in Confluence, an auction in Harper's Ferry in 1860 for a field male could draw as much as $1,600 for one. Look at what's happened with value in that 30 years. So do not be fooled by this idea that slavery will eventually extinguish itself because the economics are not in the interest of those who own the slaves. That interest, that value has dramatically increased. And the auction blocks in our counties in 1860 would show unbelievable value, never before seen astronomical value for human flesh. So it is not decreasing. And this is in the aftermath of John Brown.
one thing to think about when we think about things in flux. May 23rd, 1861, we got to vote on secession. We hardly ever talk about the other thing on the ballot at the time. And it passed with almost the exact 6-to-1 majority that secession did throughout the nearly 100 counties of the Commonwealth. And what's interesting is that this would tax slaves at full value from birth, as opposed to what the current policy, early 1861 was, which was enslaved property was given value at age 12. And then for purposes of assessing value, 10% of the value was then assessed of whatever the assessment was. So if person X is assessed at $1,000, they have not been taxed as property for the first 12 years. Now they will be taxed $100 worth of value. And the change would be to go to 100% of assessed value from birth. And it passed by a 6-to-1 majority. Which gets to the question that you all have just raised. Is there a shift from a slave society, totally dominated by the large slaveholder, to a society where other types of labor, other types of thinking compete? And is this area one of the first? It's not hard to notice that in the years after the Civil War, this area will vote differently for the rest of Loudoun County will. And I guess the question that I have is Eric correct in suggesting, although he didn't include this, that this is a society, this borderland with slaves and not a slave society? To my partner in crime here, Mike Zapp.
I just want to make a comment on Dennis's comment, because he made a very good comment. And I'd like to invite Claudette. Could you come up here with your, we have some graphic information that you should see that underlines exactly what slavery was about here in Loudoun County. Claudette is our silent partner at the Historical Society. She's done a lot of research on her own family in this area. And well, I'll let her speak.
Yes, good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Claudette Bard, and my family was probably enslaved here. I'm at a brick wall. I'm not sure what I'm learning. But my family is lived here, worked here, and are buried here. Some in the African, some in the African chapel over here in 287. So I've done a lot of research, and I was a member of the board of the Lovettsville Historical Society, and but I don't live in the area. So. But I have a couple of things that are just chilling to me. A couple of pictures, and I'm going to pass these around. One is a slave cage. This slave cage is in Fauquier County. Is in the plains it's at the Afro-American Historical Association of Fauquier County, and it's in front of there's a museum there. And the slave cage is from the slave ship Veronica. And I saw this in person, and it gave me chills. It's iron. It's sitting there. If you want to go down there and look at it, but it's my understanding is still there. It is in front of this museum. The second picture I have is a slave stone. I think I've got this for you. It's a picture of a slave stone. It was on a farm here in Lovettsville. It is a slave auction block, and there's a big stone, and and they apparently had auctions here in Lovettsville for slaves. My understanding was up Union Road. One of the board members took me down there to show me. I haven't seen this in person, but she said she was telling me where it was, but it was on private property. But I'm going to pass these around because these are chilling pictures. But it's proof that it existed here in Lovettsville. So I'm going to pass these. But I want to thank you, Eric, for bringing this information to us. I think it's long overdue. And I want to, again, I have a personal stake in that, I've been doing research, and I know my great-great-grandfather was probably enslaved, and he was probably here in 1870. I've got proof of that through the Historical Society. So, but you can see these pictures, and it's pretty chilling.
And now we go to you. Your questions, thoughts, comments, observations, connections, or maybe you put 2 and 2 together where maybe some other people think of the same thing and would like to have it given voice. And I will run around with a microphone for you so that everybody can hear you and you can be part of this. So if you will, just raise your hand if you would like to, and I see several folks over here.
That slave block, which we think was an auction block, is now at the Loudon Heritage Farm Museum in Sterling. Excuse me?
It's moved. It is.
Moved? Oh, it's at Belmont. Right?
Yes, it's moved.
Yes, it's at the Belmont burial ground for the enslaved. That was located on a farm on the other side of Lutheran Church Road from the church. And there were makes sense, because 2 families there grew up in Eberhard, who were among the largest of the German slaves. Well, Grubb family is English, so that's not totally clear. But in one of those families, this will show you how the Germans became assimilated over time in America. Bill Moore, the late Bill Moore, wonderful stories, mostly accurate as far as we know, said that of one of those families, he said they thought they were better than everybody else because they said they never had to work a day in their life. Slaves. Now that's a Southside Virginia attitude. That attitude. The whites had never had to work, and it was a bit surprising to me. I guess I tell you, even one of these families up here had that attitude, but it's quite believable that took place. So I mean, what Rich raised and others, there was change. Very definitely. We're probably 3rd, 4th generation in America by that time. Had a lot of time and assimilated more than just language. I mean, I think this is a great start. I think to drill down into the nuanced picture instead, as has been said, we would need to look at for this area, one, which the names are deceptive. I know from doing a lot of work on Revolutionary War soldiers and patriots, you can't go by the name as well as German, because the people who wrote them down have the record for English people wrote it down the way it sounded, the way they thought it was. Smith, Goodman, Smith, all kinds of one of the ones that surprised me was it's always given what they say, what of Hartman, the name of that diversity. Plus, there's a lot of questions for which families were German, which were not. The Ritchie family, I know there's this long disputes of family research. Some were definitely German, and then were English. The George family, the Fawley family, there's big disputes there as whether they were German or and in looking through some of the names in Eric's paper, there's there were a lot of families within the area settlement who were not German.
So I think to get a more finer tuned picture of it, we would need to, like Daniel Boland was one of the largest, he was an Irish Catholic, Boland, Samuel Rainey, along Route 9 in north of it, there's a different route, towards English. So you've got that. And then within the German population, I mean, what we go through pages, if I heard you right, pages in the census book where there were no slaves there. It meant that the other thing we have to get to look at is what percentage of the actual German family were slaveholders. I really have no idea. I don't know if people was it 1 in 10? Was it 1 in 5? Was it half? We don't know. That's something that, I mean, you've done great work, but we'll have to give us some help and refine this picture. And I think those very those post submissions.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to learn all of this material and hear all of this. This is absolutely fantastic. So to all of those who get to talk, thank you very much. I guess my question is, as I'm coming to understand what you're saying about assimilation and changes over time and the economic factor, is there anything in these data to run counter to the hypothesis that by 1860 economics were the only factor? If we happen to be in an area where perhaps there were smaller farms and less resources to have large groups of slaves on your property, maybe it's simply it overlays the economic map and it's not really any longer due to any philosophical or ethical issues or anything else. It's about, regardless of what people might have believed next door, but speaking more generally than the actual population laid out.
You can never, ever take race out of the principal factor that's influencing these matters. Economics is money, economics is dollars in the bank, but racial attitudes are extreme. And one reason that we have these patrols underway in Loudoun County and in Jefferson County is because people are afraid of race war in 1859. They see John Brown as race. Brown didn't see himself in the same way that he was perceived. But the idea that it's just economics is absolutely fallible in that there's no question when you read the literature of the time, you read newspapers, journals, diaries, personal letters, all of which we've read of, hundreds of thousands of them. Race is a factor over and again. We are white supremacists in 1860, and it's very evident in the literature. And some years ago, some of you might have this in your library because I lectured here. I wrote a book called September Suspense that deals a lot with racial attitude in 1862 during the war. And Southerners did not have a monopoly on racism. There was no monopoly in the South. And that book, September Suspense, is very graphic in its description of what Northerners think of race as well. And so, the idea of subjugation, of inferiority is pervasive in thinking, pervasive. And there's money to be made in economics, but there's power in subjugation.
that specific that's that money that we have slaves and not it's possible because it was really from our very all over that's the like I don't suggest that sit with it out. Yeah, where on the map is slavery.
So I wanted to address that. I think that question may be one of the most important ones we're going to be left with, because I don't think the data is clear. Ed sketched out the idea that we even can't see from the data whether this is a cultural thing, i.e. German, Scots-Irish, English, because while we're predominantly German, we're not entirely German. But I think the question you're raising, what are the factors that may be at play here to produce that pattern? Is it wealth? Is it income? Is it ethnicity? One thing we do see is very clearly that within the German settlement, the number of slaves rises over time, and maybe not with that one family, but even they went to it because the Stautzenbergers married into the Comfer family, and they didn't start with slaves, but now that family is married into a slave-owning family. In other words, things are beginning to shift. And that's the question is, what are the factors that are causing that? Is it that you can use slaves more effectively now, that they're more of value because the markets are closer and easier? But if you think we're trying to answer all questions today, I don't think we are. I think we may be trying to raise questions for us to, as we read and ponder and come across things, maybe make the connection out there. I want to go now to Catherine, who's got a question.
Thank you. I have a question. Is there other materials? Particular industries? Blacksmiths. To be how is income growing? Population's income. Schedules. Maybe. Hello. Particularly with the 1860 slave population schedule. For other Virginia counties, they have a very, very intriguing notation they've included where they have noted those who are considered fugitives, those who have run away. And I would be so intrigued to see how many are, if Loudoun County has noted that as well, if we are seeing a rise in resistance to enslavement in this population, and what those figures look like, how that compares to the rest of Loudoun.
Try to address the question at all, but one of the patterns that's happening in the area, western Fairfax County, eastern Loudoun, is having an influx of northerners settled in the area. James Smith moved to John Spring. He was born in Scotland. And lived in New York, the Dulles Airport. And in there, he clearly makes the point that he doesn't have a slave, but he's not opposed to slavery. I'm not sure whether that's true opinion of his, or whether he's concerned about not offending his neighbors. So again, there's sometimes you're never even written about people. But again, that is a change in the demographic change after 1850. To
Just a couple of thoughts on that. What has struck me in looking at the granular level of these people is mostly letters and diaries, that sort of thing, as opposed to the statistics, is how mundane it was, how easy it was for people to get used to the idea. Well, they didn't have to get used to it because they were born into it. They lived the life of a slave society. And whether you were for slavery or against slavery or hadn't thought about it, whether you were enslaved yourself, everybody, with except in certain circumstances, got bought into the society in which they lived. It was normalized, and it was only the unusual people who actively rebelled against that system. Even those like the Quakers, who were dead set against slavery among their own members, they did not work actively, except in a few exceptions, in Loudoun to break the system. It was, and yet we put them on a pedestal, and relatively, I suppose that's appropriate, but nobody or few were guilt-free, even those who did not participate in the process. Well, exactly.
That's our Supreme Court. So it's legal. People that enslaver is participating in illegal activity.
But
Accepted, adopted, or moralistically be supportive of it, but it's legal. It's like following the legal. So it's legal. And it's
legal. Fortunately, not to end on such a grim note, we are educable, and someone mentioned the Grubbs as a local family. One of the Grubbs who farmed in the Waterford area owned any number of individuals. But after the war, one of his sons became a missionary and spent 3 years in Liberia. Would have spent longer if he had not come down with one of the local diseases, ministering to the former enslaved, including Loudoun enslaved people.
I had two questions. What is the average age of a slave in this area? And what are the numbers of the slaves?
One thing you notice when you look at the slave census,
And Rich, and I think it's that one, or it's a slave schedule, as a column. Many cases are the same person, but if you father, otherwise, father didn't count.
Thank you. I have so many things running through my mind, it's not enough. But I want to revisit, I want to revisit free people of color. Because as we talked about the enslaved, almost every enslaved family, probably had someone who had been free. And I say that from my own genealogy and my own surprise, where someone said, if you want to know if someone in your family was free, just go to the 1850 census. Put the name, find the name where you live. And I did that. And I found I had this whole branch of free people. And so I say that to also, as we study the enslaved, we almost have to overlap the families on the censuses, especially 1850 and 1860, which we've been talking about. So if you have a family that you're studying and the name is Franklin, you can go to the 1850 census, look for free people. You can go back because they tell you where they're living, and you can go back and see if their family has people that are enslaved by maybe somebody the name of Franklin. Could be. But I find that going back to what Eric was talking about, Dr. Berlin, Ira Berlin, I mean, he's he's died now, but he's my hero. Wrote a whole book on free people of color. And then the most recent, for those of you who are studying people, is Warren Milter. You can get him on YouTube too. He's a professor now at the University of right here, George Washington. But he wrote, because I became familiar with him because my free people come out of North Carolina. My people who were enslaved come out of the southern part of Virginia. But this this professor wrote about Virginia, North Carolina, free people of color in North Carolina. He got so many requests that he could write another book on free people of color in the South. Because so many people said, well, you talk about North Carolina, but we're from Virginia, we're from South Carolina. So I guess what I'm saying is, as we talk about persons who are enslaved, to realize that there are some of us, and in my case, one of my free persons of color was on the 1790 census. So we're talking about people who came out of the colonial period. And therefore, as we study enslaved, we have to parallel in your communities people who were free. And in the courthouse, and help me with this, Lori, the book in Loudoun County and in Virginia, if you were free, the Register of Free Negroes is on the website, a courthouse website. So if you're curious, sometimes just run down the list of names. It's just very interesting. So studying people and the way Eric has used the study, but I encourage people to simultaneously bring out of the shadows people who were free, because they've been free since the colonial period. And there may be some people in the community, I'm not, Bronwyn and all studied free people of color also in Waterford. So I guess that's probably my comment, or I don't really have a question. Or maybe I will go back, Eric, to when you were talking about the slave person houses. And what I was thinking based on my experience and study is that small farms, which in our area is still small farms, these aren't like Mississippi, South Carolina, these are small. This is not big. And people didn't build houses. Slaves slept in your house. They slept in your barns. They slept in your kitchens. They slept in your things down in the ground, the potato things, they slept there. And so if you don't find a slave dwelling, it's because they slept in your house. And that also meant that you were sleeping you had very intimate relationships with the enslaved, which also produced people like my family who would have Irish, Scot, and English background. How does that happen? Okay, that is real. That is intimacy, and that is because many people lived in the same house. So I'm just saying, as you are curious, and if you're curious about free people of color, you could Google it today. You don't even need a book. And if you're so interested, again, Ira Berlin, Dr. Ira Berlin wrote a book on free people of color, or I think his book was, I'm not sure, Eric, Not Free. So what were you saying? Thank you, Slaves Without Masters. And then the Milner book, right now, I can't find it, but if you're interested, I'll tell you what it is later. But anyway, thank you. I just had to get some of that out.
I was just curious as to what
the impact was, you said earlier that the time it took to travel to Baltimore from this area was 3.5 days, and went down to 3.5 hours. Was there any economic benefit or influence of that other than the wheat moved faster? Was there any human impact in terms of labor that was needed, which might have affected the spread of populations, or perhaps in some cases, we were talking earlier about rentals going up on the other side of the mountains. There was an increase, that because there was now a railroad, but they only needed Black people for a limited period of time, and not didn't have to worry about transporting them to their route to further east.
Well, we don't know. We haven't studied. We don't know. It's a very good question. What is the relationship between the increased production of wheat, the availability of the railroad, and the C&O Canal? I mean, they're transporting wheat on the canal also. I mean, we think of the canal as coal, but it's not coal exclusive. And so we don't know. We do know the wheat market out here. Eric showed a map. It was a map that showed agricultural value. And I think it was in 1860. Is that correct? 1860. I really appreciate your maps. My father taught, and I really enjoyed also your modern map. Incidentally, although we are historians, 3 cheers for technology, because he was able to produce these splendid comparative maps showing all of these statistics in a way that they become visual, meaning they're not statistics in a way that they're not understandable. And so I commend you for these maps that show what the statistics are revealing, and you see it so clearly. That's technology is able to do that for us. But we don't know the answer to that. I will say this, that Baltimore is the #1 wheat producing port in the United States, wheat exporting port in the United States. And we are producing so much wheat here in Maryland and Virginia. And Virginia means Shenandoah Valley, as well as here in Loudoun County, and probably a few other counties here, bordering, that we are shipping wheat as flour to New York City, to Boston, to Philadelphia. We're feeding those people. Our wheat, our flour are feeding these major metropolitan areas. And not only are we doing that, but we're shipping abroad our flour. And so we often think of cotton. It's cotton is king. But in our area, wheat is king, queen, and the entire throne, with regard to the economic power that it brings to the people that are growing the wheat, the farmers, changing the wheat from wheat to flour, the millers. You want to get rich in my county, Washington County, you become a miller, flour miller. You get wealthy real fast. And then the transporters, either the railroad or the canal, or in our case, Frederick County and Washington County, the national road running through Boonesboro, Middletown, Frederick, on to Baltimore. All those people are making huge amounts of money off of wheat. What we don't know is what was the contribution of enslaved labor to that wealth. The oddity, again, that I pointed out in the counties I'm familiar with, Washington County and Frederick County, is that our enslaved populations have dramatically increased in the 30 years before the Civil War. But our wheat production is going.
Catherine made a comment earlier about whether the slaves were working in mill sites and all that. I don't think we have any idea about that. Mills are the primary industrial 1853 Yardley Dale has 77 mills, coal-fired mills on the map. Some of those were sawmills. Lots of mills. Industrial centers. All out and down. We don't really have any industry at all.
You're well, Matt. Well, it's 5 minutes to 5. I know that our panel and Eric will stay around for several minutes. Dennis has, with Catherine, his book Confluence for sale. He'll autograph it for you if you're interested. I know Nancy Spanis has her book on Alexander Hamilton for sale and back. We have membership blanks available if you're not a member and would like to join, or at the very least to get our e-newsletter. Hint, the single best list of history programs in this region comes from Ed Spanis's hard work on the e-newsletter of the Lovettsville Historical Society. So if you're anywhere from Adams County to Fauquier, from Fairfax to Frederick, you probably want to be signed up for that and find out what's going on. Yeah, I'm speaking next time around. What you're going to hear is the pitch that we're using for Loudoun's 250 committee. It's the 250th American Revolution coming up, and we launched that back in March officially. And so you'll hear the pitch that we're going to use to explain pre-Civil War Loudoun to people. And suffice to say, it's a pitch that might be a little different than what we would have given, say, in 1982 or something like that. But it is for the modern citizens of Loudoun. Thank all of our panelists who were willing to come and share their expertise. And most certainly, thanks to Eric Hartheis over here, who's been working hard on this. And I know you know that he'll continue to work on it. Again, please feel free to come up and ask questions. Books are available, and we hope to see you August the 13th at 2 p.m. if you're available to come in for our next installment.